Sometimes the job that saves your family is the one that quietly saves your heart. Emily Carter had stopped believing that life rewarded hard work. At 29 years old, the white American single mother measured every dollar before she spent it and counted every hour before sunrise because every extra shift meant another chance to keep a roof over her son's head. Their small apartment on the edge of Seattle was clean, warm, and filled with love, but love did not pay rent, cover groceries, or keep the lights on. Every morning she kissed her little boy goodbye before taking him to school, promising herself that somehow tomorrow would be easier than today. It never was. Her phone buzzed while she folded freshly washed uniforms after another overnight nursing shift. The message came from a private medical staffing agency she had contacted weeks earlier. A temporary home care assignment had suddenly become available. The patient required complete privacy, exceptional professionalism, and immediate availability. The compensation was nearly 3 times what she normally earned. Emily stared at the number on the screen, convinced she had misread it. She read it again, then a third time. The amount could pay several months of rent, erase overdue utility bills, repair her aging car, and finally allow her son to join the school science program he had quietly given up on. The only unusual condition was strict confidentiality. No social media. No visitors. No discussion of the patient with anyone. She accepted before fear had a chance to change her mind. The following afternoon, a black luxury sedan arrived outside her apartment building exactly on schedule. During the 40-minute drive, the city skyline slowly disappeared behind towering evergreen trees until an enormous gated estate emerged beyond iron gates. Emily had cared for wealthy patients before, but nothing prepared her for the quiet grandeur of the property. The mansion looked less like a home and more like a private resort hidden from the world. Perfect gardens surrounded wide stone pathways, while sunlight reflected across a peaceful lake behind the main residence. Yet despite its beauty, the place felt strangely empty. There was no laughter, no music, only silence. A professional house manager greeted her politely and guided her through elegant hallways filled with expensive artwork and spotless marble floors. Every employee spoke softly, almost as if raising their voice might disturb something fragile. Finally, the manager stopped outside a large bedroom overlooking the lake. Before opening the door, he lowered his voice. Mr. Ethan Brooks values privacy more than anything. He does not enjoy unnecessary conversation. Emily simply nodded. She had not come looking for conversation. She had come to earn a living. The door opened. Ethan Brooks stood beside the window instead of resting in bed as she expected. At 39, the Billionaire chief executive officer carried himself with effortless confidence despite the medical support wrapped carefully beneath his tailored shirt. His posture remained straight, but his eyes revealed a kind of exhaustion no medicine could remove. He turned slowly toward her, studying her without offering a smile. Emily noticed something unusual immediately. His expression was not angry. It was guarded, like someone who had spent too many years expecting disappointment from every stranger who walked through the door. She introduced herself calmly, explaining that she would be responsible for his daily medical care and recovery schedule. Ethan listened without interruption before quietly asking a single question. How long do you think people can pretend to care when money is involved? The room became still. Emily met his eyes without hesitation. I do not know how other people answer that question, she said gently. I only know I was hired to help you recover, and that is exactly what I intend to do. Ethan looked at her for another long moment before giving the smallest nod. Outside, soft afternoon sunlight settled across the lake, but inside the enormous mansion, neither of them realized that the deepest wound waiting to heal could never be covered with a bandage. The first morning inside the estate began before sunrise. Soft light slipped through the tall windows, painting long golden lines across polished wooden floors while the entire mansion remained almost perfectly silent. Emily arrived in the kitchen carrying a notebook instead of a phone. She reviewed Ethan Brooks's recovery schedule with careful attention, preparing medication, fresh drinking water, and a balanced breakfast exactly as his physician had instructed. Every movement was calm, organized, and professional. The house staff watched quietly from a respectful distance. They had seen many private caregivers come and go during the past several months. Some had tried too hard to impress their employer. Others had become intimidated by his wealth before finishing their first week. Emily did neither. She simply focused on the work in front of her. When Ethan entered the dining room, he offered only a brief nod before taking his seat beside the wide window overlooking the lake. Morning mist floated gently above the water while a family of ducks crossed the quiet surface. Emily placed breakfast in front of him and reviewed the schedule without unnecessary conversation. Ethan listened in silence before asking whether she had looked around the estate. Emily smiled politely and answered that she had not. She explained that she had accepted a nursing assignment, not a sightseeing tour. For the first time, the corner of Ethan's mouth lifted ever so slightly. It disappeared almost as quickly as it appeared, but Emily noticed it. After breakfast, she guided him through a series of gentle rehabilitation exercises recommended by his physical therapist. Ethan completed every movement with determination, although discomfort occasionally crossed his face. Emily never offered sympathy that sounded forced. Instead, she quietly adjusted his pace, encouraged proper breathing, and reminded him that steady progress mattered more than speed. Her voice remained calm enough to make even difficult moments feel manageable. During a short break, she noticed an old family photograph resting on a bookshelf. Dust covered the frame even though every other surface in the room had been perfectly cleaned. Without making a comment, she carefully wiped the glass with a soft cloth before returning it to exactly the same place. Ethan observed the small gesture. From across the room, most visitors admired expensive artwork or designer furniture. Emily had chosen to preserve a forgotten memory instead. Later that afternoon, the estate's executive assistant arrived carrying several folders filled with urgent business documents. He politely suggested postponing the rehabilitation session so Ethan could review company matters. Before Ethan answered, Emily quietly checked the recovery plan and reminded him that missing today's therapy could delay his progress. The assistant looked uncomfortable, expecting the billionaire to dismiss the recommendation. Instead, Ethan closed the folders and calmly said the meeting could wait 1 hour. The assistant nodded with visible surprise before leaving the room. Emily did not celebrate the decision. She simply continued the scheduled exercises exactly as planned. As the days slowly passed, a quiet routine formed between them. Every morning began with therapy. Every afternoon included a walk through the peaceful gardens surrounding the estate. Every evening ended with updated medical notes for the physician. Emily never asked about Ethan's fortune, his company, or the headlines that constantly surrounded his name. She treated him the same way she had treated every patient throughout her career. One evening, while watching the sunset reflect across the lake, Ethan finally broke the silence. He admitted that nearly everyone who entered his life eventually wanted something beyond friendship or trust. Some wanted influence. Others wanted money. A few simply wanted to stand close enough to power that they could borrow its light. Emily listened without interrupting. After a thoughtful pause, she answered softly, "I already have the reason I wake up every morning waiting for me at home. My son reminds me every day that people are far more valuable than possessions. I came here because I needed a job. I stay because every patient deserves honest care." Ethan looked toward the fading sunlight instead of answering immediately. The enormous house still echoed with silence, yet for the first time since Emily had arrived, it no longer felt completely empty. Nearly 2 weeks passed with the quiet rhythm of recovery shaping each day inside the estate. The mornings no longer felt unfamiliar. Emily arrived before sunrise, prepared Ethan Brooks's therapy schedule, and watched the first rays of light spread across the peaceful lake beyond the windows. Little by little, his movements became steadier. He no longer needed as much support during his rehabilitation exercises, and the frustration that had once shadowed every difficult step slowly gave way to quiet determination. The physical improvement was obvious, but Emily noticed something even more meaningful. The silence surrounding Ethan had begun to change. It was no longer the heavy silence of someone hiding from the world. It had become the comfortable silence of someone learning to trust another person without speaking. One rainy afternoon, while organizing medical notes inside the study, Emily accidentally noticed a leather folder left slightly open on the large wooden desk. She had no intention of looking inside, but one page had slipped onto the floor. She picked it up only to return it, and before placing it back she noticed several newspaper headlines discussing Ethan's accident. Each article described it differently. Some called it a simple vehicle collision. Others suggested mechanical failure. One even hinted that business pressure had contributed to the incident. Emily quietly returned the page exactly where she had found it without reading another word. Curiosity was never part of her profession. Respect always came first. Later that evening, Ethan found her arranging fresh flowers that one of the gardeners had placed in the sitting room. He looked at the colorful arrangement before asking why she always paid attention to details that nobody else seemed to notice. Emily smiled gently while adjusting one of the stems. She answered that small things often changed the way people felt without them realizing it. A clean photograph, fresh flowers, warm coffee, open curtains. Sometimes healing began long before medicine had the chance to work. Ethan remained silent, but something in her words lingered with him. The following morning brought an unexpected visitor. A senior executive from Ethan's corporation arrived carrying financial reports and speaking with polished confidence. Emily greeted him politely before continuing her work nearby. As she prepared Ethan's medication, she could not help noticing the conversation. The executive repeatedly encouraged Ethan to sign several urgent authorization documents immediately, explaining that time was running out and delays could cost the company millions of dollars. Ethan reached for the pen almost automatically. Before he signed, Emily quietly reminded him that one of his prescribed medications could temporarily reduce concentration for a short period after administration. She suggested waiting until later in the afternoon when his physician had recommended making important decisions. Her voice remained respectful and entirely professional. The executive forced a polite smile, but disappointment briefly crossed his face before disappearing. Ethan paused, placed the pen back onto the desk, and calmly announced that every document would wait until the following day after he had personally reviewed each page. The visitor agreed, although his expression no longer appeared as confident when he left the mansion. Emily thought nothing more about the meeting. She simply continued organizing the recovery schedule exactly as she always did. That evening, while walking beside the quiet lake during therapy, Ethan finally admitted that he had nearly signed papers he had not fully read because exhaustion had clouded his judgment. Emily answered with her usual calm honesty. She explained that recovery required patience not only for the body but also for the mind. Rushing important decisions rarely produced lasting success. Ethan looked across the peaceful water where the setting sun reflected like liquid gold. For the first time in many years, someone had protected his well-being without expecting recognition, influence, or reward. Neither of them realized that the brief interruption during that business meeting had quietly delayed a plan much larger than either of them could yet imagine. The peaceful routine inside the estate continued, yet something invisible had begun to shift beneath its calm surface. Emily could not explain why, but she started noticing details that did not belong. Every morning the rehabilitation sessions became more successful. Ethan Brooks could now walk greater distances through the gardens with only minimal assistance, and the confidence returning to his expression encouraged everyone on the staff. Even the gardeners smiled more often as they watched him spend longer hours outside instead of remaining isolated inside the mansion. Still, while Ethan's recovery steadily improved, unusual interruptions quietly became more frequent. Business meetings appeared without warning. Confidential packages arrived marked for immediate approval. Telephone calls often ended the moment Emily entered the room. None of those events directly involved her, yet together they formed a pattern that quietly settled into the back of her mind. One afternoon, after completing Ethan's scheduled therapy, Emily carried his updated medical reports toward the private office where the house manager kept confidential records. As she approached the hallway, she noticed the same senior executive who had previously rushed Ethan into signing important documents. He stood beside another corporate representative speaking in low voices. Emily had no intention of listening, but as she passed, one sentence reached her clearly. If he delays another week, the board will begin asking questions. Their conversation stopped immediately after they noticed her. Both men smiled politely, yet neither expression reached their eyes. Emily simply greeted them with professional courtesy and continued walking. She reminded herself that corporate business was not her responsibility. Her responsibility was her patient. Even so, the brief exchange remained in her thoughts. Later that evening, Ethan sat quietly in the library reviewing a small stack of documents after receiving clearance from his physician to resume limited business decisions. Emily entered only to bring him herbal tea before ending her shift. As she placed the cup beside him, she noticed one folder labeled as an emergency financial authorization. The date printed across the top caught her attention because it had been prepared nearly 3 weeks earlier, long before anyone had claimed it required immediate approval. She said nothing about the document itself. Instead, she simply asked whether every urgent decision had truly been urgent. Ethan looked at the folder, then at her, before slowly closing it without signing. "That is an interesting question," he answered thoughtfully. "I am beginning to wonder the same thing." The following morning, another unexpected visitor arrived. This time it was the company's outside legal advisor carrying additional paperwork that supposedly required Ethan's immediate attention. Emily observed from across the room, while preparing rehabilitation equipment. She noticed something remarkably similar to the previous meetings. Every conversation emphasized speed instead of clarity. Every recommendation encouraged immediate approval instead of careful review. Ethan remained polite but noticeably different from before. Rather than signing, he calmly asked detailed questions about every document placed before him. The visitors answered, yet several responses sounded surprisingly vague. Eventually they requested additional time to gather supporting information before quietly leaving the estate. After the front door closed, Ethan looked toward Emily with an expression she had not seen before. It was not suspicion. It was awakening. During their afternoon walk beside the lake, he admitted that he had spent years trusting the people closest to him, because success had convinced him that loyalty naturally followed achievement. Emily gently replied that trust remained one of the greatest strengths a person could possess, but trust also deserved wisdom. Kindness and caution could exist together without becoming fear. Ethan smiled thoughtfully while watching sunlight shimmer across the peaceful water. At that very moment, neither of them realized that the simple habit of asking one extra question had quietly begun unraveling a carefully hidden plan that had depended entirely upon Ethan never slowing down long enough to notice it. The next several days unfolded with a quiet tension that only Emily seemed able to feel. Nothing appeared openly wrong inside the estate. The gardens remained perfectly maintained. The staff continued their routines with practiced professionalism. Ethan Brooks grew stronger with every therapy session, walking nearly a mile around the lakeside paths each morning with steady confidence. To anyone looking from the outside, recovery was progressing exactly as everyone had hoped. Yet beneath that peaceful rhythm, Emily noticed the same unsettling pattern repeating itself. Every visitor connected to the company arrived carrying another urgent request. Every conversation ended with someone encouraging Ethan to make quick decisions before reviewing every detail. The pressure was always polite, carefully disguised as concern for the corporation. Emily never interrupted those discussions, but she quietly observed the expressions people wore when Ethan refused to rush. The disappointment in their eyes seemed greater than simple business frustration. One rainy afternoon, Emily entered the library to collect Ethan's blood pressure monitor after completing his daily examination. The room was empty except for a leather portfolio resting open on the coffee table. She immediately turned away, unwilling to invade his privacy. As she reached the doorway, a loose sheet slipped from the portfolio and drifted onto the floor. Instinctively, she picked it up only to return it. Before placing it back, one line unexpectedly caught her attention. The page referenced an executive board vote scheduled for the following week, yet handwritten notes in the margin mentioned obtaining approval before Ethan resumed full authority. Emily frowned for only a second before sliding the page back into its folder exactly as she had found it. She did not continue reading. She simply closed the portfolio and quietly left the room. That evening, while reviewing Ethan's medication schedule, she wrestled with an uncomfortable decision. She had promised herself never to interfere with matters outside medical care. She needed this job. Her son depended upon it. Speaking about something she had only partially observed could easily be misunderstood. She might lose the assignment that had finally brought stability to their lives. Yet another thought refused to leave her mind. If she remained silent and someone was taking advantage of Ethan during his recovery, she would also be betraying the trust that had slowly formed between them. The following morning, the opportunity arrived sooner than expected. Ethan invited her to join him on the terrace after therapy, while he enjoyed a cup of coffee overlooking the lake. Gentle autumn sunlight reflected across the calm water, making the entire estate appear peaceful beyond question. Emily stood quietly for several moments before finally speaking with careful honesty. She explained that she might be completely mistaken, and she did not wish to overstep her role. However, she had noticed several situations where important decisions seemed to be rushed unnecessarily. She encouraged Ethan to review every document personally, and to ask questions without feeling pressured by anyone, regardless of their position. Ethan remained silent long after she finished. Instead of appearing offended, he looked thoughtful. Finally, he thanked her for speaking honestly despite having nothing to gain by doing so. He admitted that very few people around him had ever risked making him uncomfortable for his own benefit. Most simply agreed with whatever seemed easiest. Later that afternoon, Ethan quietly requested complete copies of every pending corporate document, along with a detailed timeline explaining when each authorization had originally been prepared. The request surprised several executives, especially the senior executive who had visited the estate so frequently. His confident smile faded almost imperceptibly before returning again. Emily noticed the change but said nothing. She returned to organizing rehabilitation equipment exactly as she always had. As evening settled over the estate and warm lights reflected across the quiet lake, Ethan looked through the windows toward the fading sunset with a calm expression that had become increasingly familiar. For the first time since his accident, he no longer felt like a patient waiting for life to happen around him. He had begun asking questions. And somewhere beyond the peaceful walls of the mansion, someone was beginning to realize that their carefully constructed plan was slowly slipping beyond their control. The following week brought a noticeable change to the atmosphere inside the estate. Ethan Brooks had recovered enough to spend several hours each day reviewing company records instead of limiting his attention to medical appointments and rehabilitation. His physician was pleased with his physical progress, but Emily could see that something far more important was taking place. The uncertainty that had clouded his thoughts since his accident was slowly giving way to quiet confidence. Every morning he carefully examined reports that previously would have received only a quick signature. Every afternoon he requested supporting documents, financial summaries, and meeting notes that had never reached his desk before. The answers arriving from corporate headquarters became increasingly inconsistent. Dates failed to match. Recommendations contradicted earlier reports. Decisions described as urgent had been quietly prepared weeks before anyone informed Ethan about them. He never raised his voice. Instead, he simply continued asking calm questions that required honest answers. One afternoon, his longtime outside auditor arrived at the estate carrying several organized binders. Unlike the executives who constantly emphasized speed, the auditor appeared uncomfortable. After spending nearly 2 hours reviewing financial records with Ethan, he finally admitted that numerous approvals had been moving through the company without Ethan's normal level of oversight during his recovery. None of the findings suggested catastrophe, but together they revealed a pattern of decisions that benefited a small group of senior executives more than the corporation itself. Ethan listened quietly, occasionally making notes before requesting a complete independent review. Emily remained outside the office organizing medical supplies, unaware of every detail discussed inside, yet she sensed from the calm seriousness in Ethan's expression that important truths had finally begun reaching him. Later that evening he asked Emily to join him for a short walk beside the lake after therapy. The autumn air carried the scent of pine trees while gentle ripples reflected the fading sunlight. For several minutes neither of them spoke. Finally Ethan thanked her. He explained that if she had remained silent weeks earlier, he probably would have continued approving documents without hesitation simply because he trusted the people around him. Her simple advice to slow down had changed everything. Emily lowered her eyes with quiet humility before answering that she had done nothing extraordinary. She had only encouraged him to protect the future he had worked so hard to build. Ethan smiled gently. "Most people protect what belongs to them," he said. "You protected something that was never yours." His words remained with Emily long after the conversation ended. The next morning the senior executive returned to the estate expecting another routine meeting. Instead, Ethan calmly informed him that all pending authorizations would remain suspended until the independent review had been completed. Additional oversight would be introduced immediately, and every recommendation would now require transparent supporting documentation. The executive attempted to hide his surprise behind professional courtesy, but disappointment briefly crossed his face before he quietly accepted the decision and left. From the library window, Emily watched his vehicle disappear beyond the front gates. She felt relieved that Ethan had regained control of his affairs, believing the difficult season had finally come to an end. She had no idea that several people now viewed her unexpected honesty as the reason their carefully planned advantage had disappeared. Inside the mansion, the atmosphere felt lighter than it had since her first day. Staff members smiled more freely. Ethan laughed softly during physical therapy for the first time, and even the quiet halls no longer carried the same loneliness. Yet beyond the peaceful estate, consequences were beginning to unfold in ways neither Ethan nor Emily could yet see, because whenever hidden plans fail, someone eventually begins searching for the person who unknowingly stood in their way. Several days later, the independent review reached its first conclusions. Ethan Brooks spent an entire afternoon meeting with legal advisors, financial auditors, and members of the board who had remained loyal throughout the company's growth. The conversations were long, but they were calm. Every document was examined carefully. Every recommendation was supported by evidence instead of assumptions. By sunset, the truth had become impossible to ignore. A small circle of senior executives had quietly taken advantage of Ethan's absence to push decisions that favored their own interests over the future of the corporation. Company policies had not always been violated, but trust certainly had. Ethan responded without anger. He instructed the board to reverse questionable approvals, strengthen internal oversight, and replace positions that had lost the confidence of the organization. His greatest victory was not reclaiming authority. It was reclaiming clarity. While those changes quietly unfolded inside the company, Emily continued living exactly as she always had. Every evening after finishing her shift at the estate, she drove back to her modest apartment in Seattle where her 8-year-old son Noah waited with endless questions about her day. They prepared simple dinners together, completed homework at the kitchen table, and laughed over small moments that money could never purchase. One evening, Noah proudly showed her a drawing he had made at school. It pictured 3 people standing beside a peaceful lake beneath a bright autumn sky. Emily smiled when she recognized herself in Noah, but then she noticed the third figure using a walking cane. "Who is this?" she asked gently. Noah grinned. "The man you help every day," he answered. "You said he was learning to walk better. I think he probably smiles more now." Emily hugged her son, touched by the innocence that saw kindness without ever asking about wealth or status. The following week, Ethan surprised the entire household by announcing that he no longer required full-time residential nursing care. His physician confirmed that outpatient therapy would be sufficient as long as he continued following his rehabilitation plan. Everyone congratulated him, but Emily quietly began organizing her notes for the caregiver who would supervise occasional follow-up visits. She accepted the news with genuine happiness, although a quiet sadness settled inside her heart. Every assignment eventually came to an end. That was simply part of her profession. On her final scheduled afternoon inside the estate, Ethan asked whether she would join him for one last walk along the familiar lakeside path. The leaves had turned brilliant shades of gold and crimson, covering the ground like a colorful blanket beneath their feet. They walked slowly, not because Ethan needed extra support anymore, but because neither of them seemed eager to reach the end of the path. After several peaceful minutes, Ethan stopped near the wooden bench where they had shared so many quiet conversations. He looked across the calm water before speaking. He admitted that after years of building one of the country's largest companies, he had believed success depended entirely upon intelligence, discipline, and determination. His accident had taught him something entirely different. Real strength came from the people who chose honesty when silence would have been easier. Emily answered softly that healing worked the same way. Bones recovered because they were given time. Hearts recovered because someone cared enough to stay beside them until they believed tomorrow was worth facing again. Ethan turned toward her with quiet gratitude. "You were hired to help me recover," he said. "Instead, you reminded me how to live." Emily smiled warmly but simply wished him continued health before walking back toward the mansion. Neither of them noticed that several estate employees quietly watched from the distance with gentle smiles, because they had witnessed something far greater than a successful recovery. They had watched two lives change direction through nothing more extraordinary than patience, honesty, and ordinary kindness faithfully practiced one day at a time. Life settled into a quieter rhythm after Emily returned to her regular nursing assignments throughout Seattle. Each morning she drove across familiar neighborhoods, caring for elderly patients, comforting families, and returning home every evening to Noah, whose cheerful voice erased the exhaustion of even the longest days. The extraordinary weeks inside Ethan Brooks's estate slowly became a treasured memory, rather than a daily reality. Emily never spoke about the mansion unless Noah asked simple questions, and even then she described the experience as nothing more than helping someone recover after a difficult season. She never mentioned his wealth. She never mentioned the corporate investigation. She believed that chapter of her life had closed with quiet gratitude. Several weeks later, an unexpected envelope arrived at her apartment. It carried no company logo, only her name written neatly across the front. Inside was a handwritten note inviting her and Noah to attend a community celebration hosted by the Brooks Foundation, an organization Emily had only vaguely heard about through local news reports. She assumed the invitation had been sent as a polite thank you for her professional care. After some hesitation, she accepted, mostly because the event promised activities for children and free health screenings for local families. On a bright Saturday afternoon, she and Noah arrived at a newly renovated neighborhood community center overlooking Elliott Bay. Volunteers welcomed hundreds of families while children played games across the open lawn. Free medical consultations, educational workshops, and food stations filled the building with laughter instead of ceremony. Emily quietly admired how every detail focused on serving ordinary people rather than attracting attention. While Noah joined several children decorating small wooden birdhouses, Emily volunteered to help organize donated medical supplies after noticing staff members struggling to keep up with the growing crowd. She worked naturally, never expecting anyone to recognize her. Nearly an hour later, a familiar voice greeted her from behind. She turned to find Ethan walking confidently across the room without assistance. The walking cane was gone. His stride was steady. His smile reached his eyes in a way she had never seen inside the estate. Emily's face brightened with genuine happiness as she congratulated him on his remarkable recovery. Ethan thanked her warmly before introducing her to several foundation directors. To Emily's surprise, every one of them already knew her name. Ethan explained that during his recovery, he had spent many evenings thinking about the conversations they had shared. He realized that healthcare often reached people only after hardship had already become overwhelming. Inspired by Emily's quiet dedication, the foundation had expanded its support for home nursing programs, single-parent assistance, and community rehabilitation services across Washington state. Emily stood speechless for several moments. She had expected nothing beyond a polite greeting. Instead, she discovered that simple acts of compassion had quietly inspired opportunities for thousands of strangers she would never meet. As the afternoon drew to a close, Noah ran toward them holding the small birdhouse he had painted bright blue. He looked curiously at Ethan before smiling with complete innocence. "You are walking all by yourself now," he said proudly. Ethan laughed softly and nodded. "I had very good teachers," he replied. Noah looked at his mother with unmistakable pride, and Emily gently squeezed her son's shoulder without saying a word. The sun slowly lowered over Elliott Bay, covering the water with warm golden light almost identical to the sunsets they had once watched beside the quiet lake. Ethan looked toward Emily with deep gratitude before making one simple promise. Whenever the foundation helped another family rebuild their future, it would remember the nurse who had quietly reminded one man that the greatest investment any person could ever make was not in business, but in human kindness. 1 year later, the small apartment where Emily Carter and Noah had once counted every dollar before the end of each month felt brighter, not because it had become larger, but because hope had quietly replaced constant worry. Emily still worked as a home care nurse, refusing offers that would have taken her away from the patients who reminded her why she had chosen the profession in the first place. Thanks to a new partnership between local healthcare providers and the Brooks Foundation, she now helped train young nurses, entering home care, teaching them that compassion was never an extra service. It was the foundation of every meaningful recovery. Noah had grown taller over the past year. His laughter still filled every room, and his dream of becoming someone who helped people had only become stronger. Whenever classmates asked why he admired nurses so much, he simply answered that they healed more than people could see. Across Seattle, Ethan Brooks had also changed in ways few business magazines could fully explain. Financial reporters praised the company's renewed transparency and remarkable growth after the corporate reforms, but those closest to him recognized a different success. Board meetings now began with conversations about employees, instead of quarterly numbers alone. Community investments became permanent priorities rather than occasional public relations projects. Rehabilitation centers, family support programs, and nursing scholarships quietly expanded across Washington state without seeking headlines or applause. Ethan often said that businesses became stronger when the communities around them became stronger first. One crisp autumn afternoon, the Brooks Foundation opened a new community wellness center overlooking the same peaceful waters of Elliott Bay where Emily and Noah had attended the celebration months earlier. This time Emily arrived not as a guest, but as an honored speaker representing hundreds of nurses serving families throughout the region. Standing before healthcare workers, volunteers, and local residents, she spoke with the same calm sincerity that had guided every conversation inside the quiet estate. She reminded everyone that people rarely remembered the cost of treatment, as clearly as they remembered how someone made them feel during the hardest days of their lives. The room fell completely silent before warm applause filled every corner of the building. After the ceremony, Ethan walked outside where colorful autumn leaves drifted gently across the sidewalk. Emily and Noah joined him beneath the soft afternoon sunlight. Noah smiled as he looked between the two adults who had unknowingly changed each other's lives. "Mom always says one kind choice can become another," he said proudly. Ethan nodded before looking toward the families entering the new center. "She was right," he answered. "Kindness grows quietly until one day you realize it has become someone else's second chance." Emily looked across the busy entrance where children laughed while grandparents greeted volunteers with grateful smiles. None of those families knew the full story behind the building standing before them. They did not know that its beginning could be traced back to one exhausted single mother who had accepted a difficult nursing assignment simply to provide for her son. They did not know that one patient had chosen to listen when honesty would have been easier to ignore. Yet perhaps they did not need to know. The greatest acts of kindness often left no signature behind. As the afternoon sun settled gently over Seattle, Ethan thanked Emily one final time, not for helping him walk again, but for reminding him that success without compassion eventually became an empty destination. Emily smiled with quiet gratitude before taking Noah's hand as they walked toward home together. The distance ahead no longer felt uncertain, felt full of possibility. Sometimes the greatest miracle is not that one life changes another. It is that genuine kindness continues traveling from one heart to the next long after the people who started it have quietly walked away.